There's a kind of damage that doesn't happen all at once. It builds slowly, the way rust spreads beneath the surface of metal, where nothing seems wrong at first. The structure is still standing. It still holds weight. From the outside, everything appears intact, as if nothing has changed. But underneath, something is already weakening. And for people who have always felt different, this kind of process doesn't just happen. It follows a very specific pattern. Not because of a single moment, but because of accumulation. And most people don't notice it while it's happening. They only recognize it later, when something finally gives way, when a connection no longer holds, or when part of their life collapses without a clear reason. By then, the process is already far along. Something similar can happen psychologically, not through one dramatic event, but through small moments that repeat in ways that are easy to ignore. You're in a conversation, and you notice something others don't. The tone shifts, the meaning underneath the words becomes clear, and for a moment you consider saying it, bringing it into the open. But you don't. The moment passes, and nothing seems to change. But it doesn't disappear. It stays, and the next time it happens, the response is the same. And then again, and again. Over time, something begins to shift. Not in the situation, in you. And this is where the cost begins to form. Not all at once, but in ways that are easy to miss while they are happening. At first, this doesn't feel like a problem. In many situations, it actually feels like an advantage. You notice things earlier than most people. You pick up on tone, on hesitation, on what someone is trying to say without saying it directly. Because of that, you often find yourself a step ahead of the moment, already aware of where a conversation is likely to go. And that awareness changes how you respond. You let things pass. Not because you're unsure, and not because you don't understand what's happening, but because you do. You can already anticipate how your words might land, how quickly a simple observation could create tension, or how easily a situation could become more complicated than it needs to be. So instead of entering fully into the interaction, you adjust. You simplify what you say. You leave certain thoughts unspoken. You allow conversations to move forward without interfering, even when you can see the direction they are taking. Most of the time, this keeps everything stable. There's no unnecessary friction, no escalation, no visible disruption in the flow of the moment. From the outside, it looks like composure. But internally, your position in the interaction is no longer the same. Part of your attention is always slightly ahead, filtering, selecting, deciding in advance what should be expressed and what should remain unsaid. And because of that, your response is no longer fully shaped by what is happening, but by what you expect will happen next. At first, this creates a sense of control, even a sense of clarity. But over time, it changes how you experience your own presence. You are still there, but not entirely within the moment. A portion of you remains just outside of it, observing, anticipating, and quietly managing how much of yourself is allowed to enter. The interaction continues, and everything appears to function as expected. But what others engage with is only what reaches the surface, not the full depth of what you're actually perceiving. And without noticing it, you begin relating to situations through a kind of internal distance that slowly becomes familiar. This is where what feels like control begins to carry a different kind of consequence. There is another effect that tends to go unnoticed, not in the moment itself, but in what happens around it. When your perception stays internal, it begins to operate without friction. You notice patterns, you understand dynamics, you anticipate outcomes, but none of that is brought into contact with the situation as it unfolds. It remains contained within your own interpretation. And because of that, something important is missing. Carl Jung emphasized that awareness is not shaped only by what you perceive, but by how that perception interacts with reality. Insight becomes more precise when it meets resistance, when it is expressed, questioned, and forced to adjust in response to what actually happens. But when that contact doesn't occur, perception follows a different path. It continues to develop, but in isolation. It's like learning how something works without ever touching it. You can study it, observe it, even understand its structure, but there is a difference between knowing something in theory and experiencing how it behaves when you actually engage with it. Over time, that difference starts to matter. You begin to refine your understanding internally, building a sense of clarity that feels consistent, but is no longer being tested in real time. What you see starts to rely more on interpretation than on interaction. And this gradually changes how that clarity feels. Not in a way that is obvious, but enough to shift your relationship with it. You trust what you perceive, but you don't always experience it fully in the moment. You recognize patterns, but you don't always see how they unfold when engaged directly. So your understanding becomes more self-contained, more detailed in some ways, but less connected to the unpredictability of real interaction. When that contact with reality doesn't happen in the moment, it doesn't simply disappear. It shifts. Instead of becoming part of the interaction, it moves forward with you. You leave the conversation, but the perception remains active. Not as doubt, and not as confusion, but as something that never fully entered the situation where it first appeared. So your mind returns to it. You go over certain parts again, not to fix them, but to understand them more completely. You notice what was implied, what was avoided, what could have been said but wasn't. At first, this feels like depth, like you are engaging with reality in a more precise way. But over time, the experience begins to change, because the moment is no longer just something you lived. It becomes something you keep living after it has already ended. You replay the conversation in different variations. You consider how a small shift in tone, timing, or wording might have changed the direction entirely. You see the interaction not as a fixed event, but as a set of possibilities that were never fully explored. And while this expands your understanding, it also creates a certain distance from the experience itself. Because for you, the moment doesn't end where it ends for everyone else. It continues. And this is where something more subtle, but more significant, begins to take shape. You start noticing that your experience of the same situation feels different from the people who were there with you. They move on. You don't, at least not in the same way. For them, the conversation is over. For you, it is still unfolding. And over time, this creates a quiet sense of separation. Not because you are disconnected from others, but because you are still engaging with something they have already left behind. You begin to feel out of sync, and without realizing it, this becomes one of the ways that feeling different starts to take form. Not just in how you see things, but in how your experience of the same moment no longer matches the people around you. It shapes how other people experience you, even if no one can clearly explain what has changed. Most interactions follow a certain rhythm. There is a flow of reactions, small adjustments, subtle signals that guide how a conversation moves forward. Someone speaks, the other responds, tension appears and is either reinforced or softened, and the exchange continues almost automatically. When that rhythm is shared, interaction feels natural. It doesn't require effort, because both people are participating in the same structure without needing to think about it. But your participation is no longer guided in that same way. You are not responding only to what is being said. You are responding to what you already understand about it. You see where certain dynamics lead, and because of that, you don't enter them fully, even when they are still unfolding. This creates a slight interruption in the expected flow. Not enough to cause conflict, but enough to change the tone of the interaction. Sometimes the conversation slows down in a way that doesn't quite resolve. At other times, it ends before it reaches the depth it could have reached. There are moments where a response would normally carry the exchange forward, but instead, it simply doesn't come in the same way. And although nothing appears wrong on the surface, the structure of the interaction has shifted. People may not consciously register what is happening, but they respond to it. Some feel that you are more distant, even when you are fully present. Others experience a kind of uncertainty, as if they cannot fully predict how you will engage. And in certain cases, the connection stabilizes at a more limited level, not because depth is impossible, but because the usual path toward it is no longer available. What is felt, more than understood, is that something in the exchange is no longer being completed in the way it used to be. And that subtle change is enough to reshape how people approach you, how long they stay engaged, and how far the interaction is able to go. What becomes clearer at this point is that this pattern is not only about how you choose to respond. There is something underneath those choices. Earlier, you could recognize the adjustments as they happened. You could see yourself holding back, allowing situations to move forward without interruption, and it often felt like control, like a deliberate way of keeping things stable. But when you look more closely, not everything that remains unspoken comes from a conscious decision. Some of it comes from something you don't fully move toward. Carl Jung described this as the shadow, not as something negative, but as aspects of your perception and your response that don't easily fit into how you've learned to present yourself. You can see it in ordinary situations. Someone makes a comment about your appearance, something subtle enough to pass as casual, but with a tone that doesn't quite match the words. It might sound like a compliment, but it lands differently, as if there is a comparison or a quiet judgment underneath it. You notice it immediately. There is a brief moment where a more direct response is available to you. You could ask what they meant. You could reflect it back. You could shift the tone of the interaction in a way that makes that layer visible. But instead, you let it pass. Not because you didn't understand it, but because moving toward that response would require a different kind of presence, one that is more direct than what you usually allow in these situations. In another moment, someone questions a decision you made, not openly, but in a way that subtly places you in a defensive position. You recognize the structure of it right away. You could respond in a way that resets the frame, something simple and clear that re-establishes your position without escalation. But again, that response doesn't fully take shape. The conversation continues within the same tone, and the dynamic remains exactly as it was. These situations don't stand out individually. They are easy to move past. But they reveal something important. Because what remains outside the interaction is not only what might create tension. It is also the part of your perception that is more precise, more direct, and less adapted to what is expected. And when that part doesn't enter the moment, the interaction doesn't reorganize. It continues, but within the same structure. The same tone, the same roles, the same limits. Nothing breaks, but nothing changes either. And this is where the pattern stops being about what others are doing and begins to reflect what you are not bringing into the moment. And when that part of you remains outside the interaction, the effect doesn't stay contained in those moments. It carries forward. Because what is not expressed doesn't enter reality. It doesn't shape decisions, it doesn't redirect situations, and it doesn't become part of what actually takes form. So life continues, but without that influence. You begin to notice it in ways that are difficult to ignore. In relationships, for example, where there was a clear sense that something meaningful could develop, but it never moved beyond a certain point. The connection exists, the conversations happen, but it never becomes something defined, something that stabilizes and grows. Not because something went wrong, because something never entered. You see it in work as well. There are moments where you understand exactly what needs to be said. You can see the flaw in a plan, the misalignment in a decision, or the opportunity that others are overlooking. The structure is clear to you before it becomes obvious to anyone else. But instead of stepping into that space, you remain within what is already established. You contribute, but you don't redirect. And the situation moves forward without that intervention. It follows the same path it was already on. And this is where the effect becomes visible in a different way. Because what you are able to see is not the same as what your life begins to reflect. There is a gap between your internal clarity and your external results. Not in the sense of failure, but in the sense of limitation. Your life begins to organize itself around what is consistently expressed, not around what is fully perceived. And that distinction matters, because this is where the pattern moves beyond interaction and begins to define what actually takes shape in your life. You start to recognize it when you revisit certain moments that once felt open, full of possibility, as if something could have developed from them. Conversations that carried more depth than what was expressed, connections that seemed to have direction, situations that held a kind of momentum that never fully materialized. When you look at them now, they remain almost exactly where they started. There was interaction, there was presence, but there was no transition into something more defined. And what makes this difficult to process is that nothing clearly failed. There is no point you can isolate and say, this is where it stopped. It simply never became. And that is often harder to process than something that clearly ended. That same pattern begins to appear in other areas of your life. You remember phases where something could have shifted, where a different kind of response, a slightly more direct movement, might have changed the direction of what followed. Not in a dramatic sense, but in very specific moments that you can still recall with clarity. And now, those moments are no longer available in the same way. Not because of time in a general sense, but because the context that made them possible has changed. People moved forward, situations evolved, and what once felt open is now closed. What remains is not exactly regret. It is something more precise than that. It is the awareness of what never entered reality, of what was present, understood, and even recognized, but never allowed to take form. And once that becomes clear, it changes how you relate to your own past. Because it is no longer just a sequence of events. It becomes a pattern of possibilities that were never fully lived. What gives all of this a different weight is not just what didn't happen. It is the realization that these patterns don't feel like isolated moments anymore. They begin to feel familiar. The way you move through situations, the way you respond, the distance between what you perceive and what you express. None of that stands out as something unusual when you are inside it. It feels natural. And that is where the meaning of too late begins to change. Because what feels like time passing is often just repetition becoming invisible. It is about something becoming so integrated into how you operate that it no longer feels like something you can question. The pattern becomes invisible, not because it is hidden, but because it is consistent. You don't experience it as a limitation. You experience it as the way things are. And from that point on, nothing interrupts it. Not because it is impossible to change, but because there is no clear moment that demands change. Everything still works. Life continues. You remain capable, aware, and engaged. But the structure underneath remains the same. And this is what makes it difficult. Because the longer a pattern operates without being challenged, the more it defines the range of what feels natural to you. And when something feels natural, it rarely feels urgent to change it. So too late is not about losing the ability to change. It is about losing the sense that change is necessary. What begins to change is not the past, and not the fact that certain moments never took form. Those remain where they are, as part of a pattern that can now be seen more clearly. What changes is your relationship with what is happening in the present. Because once that pattern becomes visible, it can no longer operate in the same unconscious way. The distance between what you perceive and what you allow into the world is no longer invisible, and that changes the structure of your attention. Carl Jung described individuation as the process of bringing what is internal into alignment with how one lives, not by forcing expression, but by allowing what is true to take form in reality. It is not simply a matter of insight, but of integration. And integration requires contact. It requires that what you recognize internally is no longer held at a distance, but gradually enters the situations where it was previously withheld. This does not happen all at once, and it does not require dramatic change. It happens in specific moments where the usual pattern becomes visible, and instead of following it automatically, you remain present long enough to allow a different response to emerge. Not a reaction, but an alignment. A response that is consistent with what you actually see, rather than with what is expected. And this is where the process begins to shift in a meaningful way. Because what was previously contained starts to participate. What was only understood begins to take form. And the interaction, which once followed a familiar structure, begins to reorganize around a different level of presence. From a Jungian perspective, this is not about becoming someone new, but about reducing the distance between the persona and the deeper structure of the self. It is about allowing elements that were previously held in the background, often associated with the shadow, to enter conscious expression in a way that no longer fragments the experience. The result is not immediate transformation, but a gradual change in how life responds. Because when what you perceive is no longer kept separate from how you act, the pattern that once defined the limits of your experience begins to loosen. And from that point on, your life is no longer shaped only by what you understand internally, but by what you are willing to bring into reality, even when it alters the structure of what is already familiar. The cost was never in being different. It was in everything that difference never allowed to exist. Because when you stop holding certain parts of yourself back, even in small ways, the dynamics around you don't remain the same. People react differently. Situations unfold in ways that feel unfamiliar at first, and the patterns that once felt stable begin to lose their hold. If you've ever noticed that, if you've ever felt that something changed in how others respond to you without a clear reason, there is a deeper explanation for it. I explored that in another video, where we look at what begins to happen after this shift starts to take place.